Two kinds of questions arise in connection with these vigorous debates about the media and democracy. The first are questions of fact, the second are questions of value. The basic question of fact is whether the media have indeed adopted an adversarial stance, perhaps with excessive zeal, whether in particular they undermine the defense of freedom in wartime and threaten free institutions by flagellating ourselves and those in power. If that turns out to be true as a matter of fact, we may then ask a further question: would it be proper to impose some external constraints to ensure that the media keep to the bounds of responsibility? Now, the question of fact, which is of course fundamental, is rarely argued. The case is assumed to have been proven. There are some, however, who have argued that the factual premises are simply false. Let's begin with the broadest claims. Let's have a look at the functioning of the so-called free market of ideas. There's an interesting study by Benjamin Ginsberg of the mobilization of popular opinion to promote state power, and after reviewing many features of this, he concludes that, I'm now quoting Ginsberg, he concludes that the marketplace of ideas built during the 19th and 20th centuries effectively disseminates the beliefs and ideas of the upper classes while subverting the ideological and cultural independence of the lower classes. Through the construction of this marketplace, Western governments forged firm and enduring links between socioeconomic position and ideological power. They've therefore permitted upper classes to use each to buttress the other. In the United States in particular, the ability of the upper and middle classes to dominate the marketplace of ideas has generally allowed these strata to shape the entire society's perception of political reality and the range of realistic political and social possibilities. While Westerners usually equate the marketplace with freedom of opinion, the hidden hand of the market can be almost as potent an instrument of control as the iron fist of the state. Now, these conclusions have some initial plausibility on guided free market assumptions that are not particularly controversial. Segments of the media that can reach a substantial audience are major corporations, closely integrated with even larger conglomerates. Like other businesses, they sell a product to buyers. The market to which they sell is advertisers, and the product is audiences, with a bias towards more wealthy audiences, which improve advertising rates. So, in effect, the media are major corporations selling privileged audiences to other businesses. It would hardly come as a surprise if the picture of the world they present were to reflect the perspectives and the interests of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Furthermore, those who occupy managerial positions in the media or gain status within them as commentators belong to the same privileged elites, and it would be reasonable to expect that they would share the perceptions, aspirations, and attitudes of their associates. These reflect their own class interests as well. Journalists entering the system are unlikely to make their way unless they conform to these ideological pressures. Generally, they conform by internalizing the values. It's not easy to say one thing and believe another, and those who fail to conform will tend to be weeded out by familiar mechanisms. There are many other factors that induce the media to conform to the requirements of the state-corporate nexus. To confront power is costly and difficult. High standards of evidence and argument are imposed, and critical analysis will naturally not be welcomed by those who are in a position to react vigorously and to determine the array of rewards and punishments. Conformity to a patriotic agenda, in contrast, imposes no such costs. Charges against official enemies barely require substantiation. They're also protected from correction. Correction can always be dismissed as apologetics for the criminals. Someone who attributes the best intentions to the United States, while perhaps deploring failure and ineptitude, requires no evidence for this stance. So, for example, no evidence is required when we ask why success has continued to elude us in the Third World. Why cannot a nation of such vast wealth, power, and good intentions accomplish its purposes more promptly and more effectively? I'm again quoting Landrum Balling. One needs no evidence to condemn the Soviet Union for aggression in Afghanistan, and for support of repression in Poland. It's quite a different matter when one turns to U.S. aggression in Indochina, or its efforts to prevent the political settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict over many years. All of this is readily documented, but it's unwelcome and therefore a non-fact. No argument is demanded for a condemnation of Iran or Libya for state-supported terrorism. Discussion of the prominent, arguably the dominant role of the United States and its clients in organizing and conducting this plague of the modern era, that elicits only horror and contempt, and evidence, however compelling, is dismissed as irrelevant. As a matter of course, the media and the intellectual journals either praise the United States for dedicating itself to the struggle for democracy in Nicaragua, or they criticize it for the means it has employed to pursue this laudable objective. A challenge to the underlying patriotic assumption is virtually unthinkable within the mainstream, and if such a challenge were permitted expression, it would be dismissed as a variety of ideological fanaticism and absurdity, even if it were backed by overwhelming evidence. Not a very difficult task in this case. Case by case, we find that conformity is the easy way. It's a path to privilege and prestige. Dissidence carries personal costs. These costs may be severe, even in a society that lacks such means of control as death squads, psychiatric prisons, or extermination camps. The very structure of the media is designed to induce conformity to established doctrine. In a 3-minute stretch between commercials, or in 700 words, it's impossible to present unfamiliar thoughts or surprising conclusions with the argument and the evidence that's needed to give them some credibility. It's a natural expectation that the major media will reflect the perspectives and the interests of established power. These expectations, in fact, are amply fulfilled. That has been argued by a number of analysts. My co-author Edward Herman and I have published extensive documentation in joint work and separately to support a conception of how the media function that differs quite sharply from the standard version, what we call a propaganda model of the media. According to this propaganda model, the media serve the interests of state and corporate power, which are closely interlinked. The media frame their reporting and analysis in a manner that supports established privilege and that limits debate and discussion accordingly. To subject the model to a fair test, we've selected examples that are as closely paired as history allows. Crimes attributable to official enemies versus those for which we and our clients bear responsibility. Good deeds, for example elections, conducted by official enemies versus those in U.S. client states. There are by now literally thousands of pages of documentation supporting the conclusions of the propaganda model. By the standards of the social sciences, it's very well confirmed. If there is a serious challenge to this conclusion, I'm unaware of it. The highly regarded Freedom House study that I mentioned before, which is held to have demonstrated the adversarial character of the media, that study collapses upon analysis. It contains innumerable errors and misrepresentations, even falsification of its own documentation, and when all of this is corrected, little remains beyond a complaint that the media were too pessimistic in their pursuit of a righteous cause. I know of no other studies that fare any better. So to summarize, we have two models of the media. There's a sort of standard model, which is that the media are adversarial, cantankerous, obstreperous, that they confront state and private power, and then there's a debate over whether they do this too excessively. That's the standard model. According to the propaganda model, very much the opposite is true. The media are docile, submissive, and they serve the interests of state and corporate power. Those are the two models. And as I've suggested, the propaganda model has very extensive documentation to back it. I'll be giving some examples as I proceed. Now, there are, to be sure, other factors that influence the performance of social institutions as complex as the media. And one can find exceptions to the predictions of the propaganda model. Nevertheless, the propaganda model, I believe, has been shown to provide a very good first approximation which captures essential properties of the media and, in fact, essential properties of the dominant intellectual culture more generally. Journalists often meet a high standard of professionalism in their work. They exhibit courage, integrity, and enterprise, and this includes many of those who report for media that adhere closely to the predictions of the propaganda model. There's no contradiction here. What is at issue is not the honesty of the opinions expressed or the integrity of those who seek the facts. Rather, what is at issue is the choice of topics, the range of opinion permitted expression, the unquestioned premises, and the general framework that's imposed for the presentation of a certain view of the world. Now, I will give a number of examples to illustrate the workings of the propaganda model, but in these lectures I want to rely on the ample material that's in print to establish the basic case. This work has elicited much outrage, vituperation, and falsification, but to my knowledge there is no serious effort to respond to the critique. Rather, such critiques are simply dismissed. Notice again that this is in conformity to the predictions of the propaganda model. Typically, debate over media performance within the mainstream includes critics of the adversarial stance of the media and responses by people who defend the media. But such debate excludes any critique of the media for adhering to the predictions of the propaganda model. It even excludes any recognition that this might be a conceivable position.